guests today. The first one, Aisha Al Adawiya, is the founder of Women in Islam Incorporated, an organization of Muslim women which focuses on human rights and social justice. Ms. Al Adawiya organizes and participates in conferences, symposiums, and other forums on Islam, gender equity, conflict resolution, cross-cultural understanding, and peace building. She also represents Muslim women's non-governmental organizations at United Nations forums. Ms. Al Adawiya coordinates Islamic input for the preservation of the Black Religious Heritage Documentation Project of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. She also serves as a consultant to numerous interfaith organizations and documentary projects on the Muslim American experience. Additionally, she serves on the boards of numerous organizations related to the interests of the global Islamic community. She's also a guest host and producer of Tahrir Pacifica Radio in New York City. We also have Asha Noor, who is a racial justice and human rights activist. She's a peace building and conflict resolution specialist, educator, and writer. She currently is the programming and outreach director at CARE for Safe Spaces, the largest Muslim civil rights organization. Noor is the youngest board member of the Michigan Coalition of Human Rights and a representative for Muslim Arts Speakers Bureau. She is a fellow with the Detroit Equity Action Lab, which is a program of Wayne State Law School addressing structural and systematic challenges in Detroit. She previously served as the Advocacy and Civic Engagement Specialist for National Take on Hate program, and she's worked with both domestic and abroad programs in conflict zones with marginalized communities, including women, Afro-Indigenous groups, as well as trauma victims. Before coming to Take on Hate, she worked with Islamic Relief USA, and she gained a lot of understanding on humanitarian issues. So please help me in welcoming both of these speakers. So the way this is going to work is I'm going to pass on the mic to Aisha, and she's going to speak a little bit, and then Asha will speak a little bit, and then we will also be taking questions from the audience as well as questions that we have prepared. And so if you have any questions, there will be people passing around sheets of paper and pens, and then our lovely speakers will also be addressing those points.
Assalamu alaikum. You know, one of the things that I usually ask is that we close our ranks, and if you don't mind, if we could all kind of move to the center and up front so that we can feel our own power, inshallah. So, you know, we've been asked to talk about the legacies of some of the early freedom fighters, Malcolm X, who's my mentor, Martin Luther King Jr., Gandhi. We'll also include Medgar Evers and a few women, Fannie Lou Hamer, Rosa Parks, those kinds of women. And in our own tradition, all of those Sahabiyat who surrounded the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the struggles and the contributions that they left for us. I think that in our tradition, we have a lot to build on and grow on, and much of the, I think, hesitancy that we have in terms of stepping out and claiming those legacies is, first and foremost, is that we are not aware of them or deeply familiar with them. So I would think that it would behoove us to study more deeply about who our predecessors are, how they struggled, what they contributed, their successes, and of course the challenges that they faced. I don't know how much of the history of the civil rights movement we're familiar with, but there are also struggles that are built on prior struggles going back to the founding of the country. So the civil rights struggle or movement is something that's more closely referred to in our memory. But there are struggles that precede the civil rights movement. We called out people like Malcolm X, for instance. And of course, Malcolm X, I think, is probably the last in the line of people who were listed for me to speak about, and the movement that he led that we're still trying to live out. But Malcolm was one of those persons who was not readily accepted by mainstream Muslims initially. Also figures like Muhammad Ali, for instance, who was an extension of that movement. But clearly, this is a man who was called by Allah to struggle for what he felt was right, who didn't hesitate to take positions on issues that needed to be raised of the day, of the time, and suffered tremendously for the positions, of conscience that he took. But ultimately, we see now that those were connected on so many levels, on so many continents, by so many people. So we know that Allah calls people to work, and it's our job to try and find out what is our calling, what is our passion, to know our history, and then seek avenues to live into the legacies, the work that people have already created, the paths that have been laid down for us. And of course, there was Martin Luther King, who was, I think, more readily accepted by mainstream society, certainly earlier on. But later on in his struggle for justice, when he ventured out to speak about some of the injustice in terms of war, for instance, which is when he began to make some statements that were perceived to be out of bounds for a religious leader or someone speaking about civil rights. But he began to talk about these issues, and of course was marginalized, as was Malcolm X. Mahatma Gandhi, in another historical context and certainly on another continent, did tremendous work in terms of the liberation and extrication from colonial rule in India, and then going on into South Africa to do some advocacy for justice there. There are some concerns around some of his legacy in terms of how he positioned himself in relation to identification with Black Africans and their struggle. Nonetheless, he made a contribution, and we acknowledge that. There are people also like Medgar Evers, who was assassinated for similar kind of work. Medgar Evers was killed in the process of doing similar work as Martin Luther King was. I noticed in the lineup we didn't have any women listed, and we have a long line of women who were active in liberation struggles. Women like Rosa Parks, who is more familiar with us. We know about her in terms of her refusal to give up her seat, which sparked the Montgomery boycott, which really ignited the civil rights movement. But what we don't know about her is that before that event, she had been primed quite some time before doing work, and in fact she was an advocate for women who had been sexually abused. So there are, hidden histories about women who struggle for similar goals, but they get very little recognition for the work that they do, and we don't know about them. So I think that that's something that we're dealing with in the current context as well. Then there are women like Fannie Lou Hamer, who was very instrumental in staking out a platform with the National Democratic Convention. This is some years ago. So many women, not to mention the women who surrounded the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the outstanding legacies that they left for us. And again, we don't know about those women to the extent that we should, and I'm hoping that the people in this room, certainly young people and specifically young women, are going to have to do the work to bring forth the knowledge and the history about our own predecessors and what contributions they made, and hopefully you can aspire to follow, their lead, inshallah. So I don't know how long you want me to carry on.
That was great. Honestly, I could listen to you for hours, but I will pass on the mic to Asha Noor to kind of get your input on this. And then after that, we have some questions prepared, and then we'll also open up to the audience. So this is your moment.
Thank you so much. Can we please get a round of applause for Sister Aisha? I rarely get kind of shy when I do public speaking, but to be sitting amongst a giant in our community is truly a humbling experience. For those of you who don't know her work, it is very extensive and it has supported many parts of our community for a very long time, so thank you. And so I don't want to touch upon the same topics or speaking points as my dear sister and elder in the community. But one of the things that I did notice was the lack of diversity gender diversity in terms of the list of civil rights leaders we were given. I just want to say a few things about the great men that were listed. Indeed, they were great men tasked with immense challenges facing their people, and they had to rise to that occasion. And that's what they all had in common. They wanted freedom for their people, and they wanted a path of righteousness for their people. This includes Martin, this includes Malcolm, this includes Nelson Mandela, Gandhi, although his legacy is quite contentious, and above all, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who is our prophet and leader. I would also agree with Sister Aisha and caution against glorifying Gandhi. Although he fought vehemently for the liberation of the Indian people, he was very anti-Black in his sentiments, writings, and beliefs. So for me, I see him for what he was, a man who liberated his people and his people alone by cementing a racial hierarchy which positions Black at the very bottom. I simply cannot celebrate a man who furthers his agenda through a means of stepping on Black people or who considers another group less than. For me, that's not a liberation fighter. For me, that's not a freedom fighter. What he did for his people was quite honorable, but if that's where it stops, that's not the type of work that we need to be engaging in and not the type of legacy we should be celebrating. I also, to echo the points of my sister here, take issue with the fact that in this prompt we only highlighted men as if women weren't great leaders of movements and the backbone of social change. This is very untrue and perpetuates more harm and erasure of our dear leaders. I think of Rosa Parks as well, and I think of Mama Layla, who is a Detroit native, who was a close friend and confidant of Miss Rosa Parks, and a dear mentor of mine, a woman who I seek her knowledge and expertise daily as I make the decisions for how to move my community forward. We have civil rights icons that are women, that are still alive, that have so much knowledge and wisdom that we can learn from. I think of the late Betty Shabazz, the wife of Malcolm X, and a civil rights leader in her own right. I think of Sister Clara Muhammad, who established Islamic schools and the ability to have them, as we do today all around the country. She struggled for liberation of Black people and of Muslims and of all Muslims to be able to have Islamic schools and to have this culture and legacies that we do today. I think of my home country of Somalia and Hawa Tako, who was a martyr. She was the very first martyr against Italian colonialism. No one thinks of her when they think about overthrowing the Italian colonial rule in Somalia, but she was a woman. She was the first to put her life on the line to make sure that people in my country could practice Islam freely and be proud of their African culture and their heritage and stick to their language and stick to their Islam. So for me, when I think of liberation, I also caution against erasing the women who have sacrificed everything, including their lives. And so I think that when we engage in community, we should always be asking questions: who's not on the list, who are we not celebrating, and who are we not mentioning? And it's often people that we like to put in the margins of society, whether it's within the Muslim community. It could be the Black community within the Muslim community. It can be women. It can be those who are more recent immigrants. We often like to fit everything within the status quo. And I think that that only perpetuates erasure, and it only allows for us to celebrate a select few. When alhamdulillah we look at our Muslim American community, and it is one of the most diverse communities ethnically, racially, politically, unfortunately, because I wish we were all liberal. But in many ways and shapes and forms, we're a very diverse community, and I think we need to celebrate that. And when we look at civil rights leaders and we learn from their movement, we have to understand that we can't just look at the 5 top people and say, okay, the civil rights movement was the movement because of Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, and one other person like Nelson Mandela. We have to think about the women and children who have been erased from the legacy. How many of you know about the Children's March in 1963 in Alabama? I mean, that's a huge part of our civil rights history, and we would not have been able to defend against and stop segregation in the South without that very critical march and protest, and it was led by children. So I think that it's very important for us to dig deep and not only think about what's taught K through 12, the only 2 leaders, and they're always men, and we need to explore further and think about the children. Where were they? Were they absent? Think about the children of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X who had to outlive their fathers who were great leaders. Think about the impact on their lives and the work that they ended up doing to continue that legacy. And most importantly, the women who have always been at the forefront of these movements. So again, I just encourage you guys to think really critically and make sure that you see yourself in the movement. You're young, most of you are very young. If the children's movement could have done it in 1963, what's to say that you guys can't go out there and organize today? Children as young as 5 years old were in that march. So I think that that is something really important for all of us to take away, that you don't need to be this great Martin Luther King or this great Malcolm X to be able to affect social change and be able to have a leadership role in your community. So thank you.
I'm just gonna grab this for you.